The champagne never touched Preston Calloway's lips before he was already toasting his own victory. He stood in the private dining room at the Ashworth Club, glass raised, laughing loud enough for 3 tables to hear him. He had just come from his lawyer's office, where the final divorce settlement had been drafted, and he wanted every person in that room to know exactly what he had accomplished. 22 years of marriage, and Vivian was walking away with a single asset, an old lake house in the Adirondacks that hadn't been renovated since her mother passed. Preston kept saying the same line to anyone who would listen. She gets the house nobody wants, and I keep everything that matters. He believed it completely. He had no idea that the house he was so eager to hand over was about to become the reason his entire empire collapsed. Preston was 51, silver-haired, and dressed the way men dress when they want a room to remember them. He ran Callaway Meridian, a private equity firm that had spent the last decade buying distressed manufacturing companies and selling them off in pieces. To the outside world, he was a self-made success story, a man who had clawed his way from a regional accounting firm to a corner office overlooking Central Park. What the outside world didn't know was that Callaway Meridian had nearly collapsed 3 separate times, and 3 separate times, an emergency credit line had appeared out of nowhere to save it. Preston told his board it was his relationships. He told his colleagues it was his instincts. He never once asked who was actually behind the money that kept saving him, and that failure to ask was the first mistake that would cost him everything. Across the table sat Diane Marsh, his divorce attorney, a woman known for winning cases before they reached a courtroom. Diane had built her reputation dismantling prenuptial loopholes and burying opposing counsel and paperwork they couldn't keep up with. "You should be thrilled," Diane told him, sliding her wine glass in a small circle. "The prenup is airtight. Vivian keeps the lake house and $40,000 in a settlement account. Everything else, the properties, the investment portfolio, the firm, stays exactly where it belongs. With you." Preston nodded, satisfied, already thinking about how he'd describe the outcome at his next investor dinner. He had spent months preparing his friends for this moment, letting them know that Vivian had grown distant, that she'd stopped being the partner he needed, that he was finally free to build the next chapter of his life without her quiet, watchful presence beside him. He thought about the morning he'd told her. Vivian had been at the kitchen counter, sorting through a box of her late mother's letters, when he set the papers down beside her coffee. She hadn't argued. She hadn't cried. She had simply looked at the documents, then up at him, and asked if he was certain this was what he wanted. "I've never been more certain of anything," Preston had said. "You'll have the lake house. That should be more than enough for someone who never wanted much anyway." Vivian had nodded slowly, closed the box of letters, and said nothing else. At the time, Preston had mistaken her silence for defeat. He would later understand it was the opposite. She hadn't been shocked by the papers. She had been waiting for them. Then the doors opened, and Vivian Callaway walked in wearing a tailored navy suit that Preston had never seen before, her expression calm in a way that unsettled him more than tears ever could have. Beside her walked an older man Preston didn't recognize, carrying a worn leather satchel and moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had nowhere else more important to be. Preston leaned toward Diane and whispered that Vivian must have hired some retired small-town lawyer out of desperation. Diane had already looked the man up. His name was Walter Ashford, and according to public records, he'd spent the last 30 years handling estate and trust law for private family offices upstate, rarely appearing in a courtroom because his clients rarely needed one. Preston dismissed the detail entirely. He had already decided how this morning would end. Judge Elena Marsh, no relation to Diane, took the bench precisely on time and called the case. Preston Callaway versus Vivian Callaway, petition for dissolution of marriage. Diane stood immediately, confident and composed, and laid out the argument she had rehearsed dozens of times. The prenuptial agreement, she explained, was comprehensive, properly executed, and reviewed by independent counsel on both sides at the time of signing. It clearly designated all business interests, real estate, and investment holdings as Preston's separate property. She requested the court enforce the agreement as written. The judge accepted the document and began reviewing it in silence, the only sound in the room the soft rustle of pages turning. Preston watched Vivian. She sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes forward, showing none of the anxiety he had expected and, if he were honest, hoped for. Walter Ashford rose slowly when the judge asked whether the defense contested the agreement's validity. "We do not dispute the signature," Walter said, his voice measured and unhurried. "We contest its enforceability under Section 14 of the agreement itself, specifically the clause addressing undisclosed financial interests connected to a spouse's family." Diane objected immediately, calling it a delay tactic, but the judge allowed Walter to continue. He explained that the clause voided asset protections if one party had knowingly benefited from capital connected to the other spouse's family, without disclosing that benefit to the court. Preston frowned, flipping through his own copy of the prenup, insisting under his breath that the clause was standard language about inheritance, nothing more. He had no memory of it meaning anything else. Then Walter said the words that changed the temperature of the room. "Your Honor, is Preston Calloway aware that the 3 emergency credit lines that saved Callaway Meridian from collapse in 2016, 2019, and 2022 were extended through a private lending vehicle controlled by the Ashford Family Trust, the same trust that holds the deed to the Adirondack property he has spent this proceeding attempting to discard?" The courtroom went silent. Preston's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Diane turned slowly toward him, her expression shifting from confidence to something closer to alarm. Preston finally managed to speak, his voice thinner than he intended. "That's impossible. Those loans came from an investment group called Birchline Capital. We vetted them ourselves." Walter allowed himself the smallest, driest smile. "Birchline Capital," he said, "is a holding entity wholly owned by the Ashford Family Trust. Vivian's late mother established it in 1994. Vivian has held majority control since her mother's passing 4 years ago." Preston turned to Vivian, searching her face for some explanation, some sign that this was a misunderstanding. She looked back at him without anger, only a quiet, tired clarity. "I never lied to you, Preston," she said. "You never asked. You told everyone you built Callaway Meridian from nothing, and I let you believe that, because for years I hoped you'd become the man I married instead of the man the money turned you into. Every time the firm was about to fail, I approved the funding myself. Not because I wanted credit, because I still loved you, and I kept hoping you'd notice who was actually standing behind you." Preston sat frozen, the weight of a decade's worth of assumptions collapsing at once. He had spent years telling investors, colleagues, and friends that his success was entirely his own, never once suspecting that the woman he now dismissed as owning nothing but an old lake house had been quietly deciding his company's survival the entire time. Diane leaned toward him, her voice low and urgent. "Preston, listen to me carefully. If the funding source was connected to her family and undisclosed to this court and to your own investors, we are no longer only discussing a divorce settlement." Preston barely heard her. He was still staring at Vivian, replaying years of dismissive comments. The times he'd called her simple for preferring quiet weekends at the lake house over his firm's black tie galas. The times he'd told colleagues she wouldn't understand the pressures of running a real business. Walter continued, unhurried, laying a slim folder on the table. "Under Clause 14, any assets Preston Callaway holds that were directly enabled by undisclosed capital from Vivian's family revert to the originating trust upon proof of non-disclosure. That proof, Your Honor, is the funding history I've just submitted into evidence, cross-referenced with Mr. Callaway's own investor disclosures, which state no outside family capital was ever involved in the firm's operations." Judge Marsh reviewed the documents for several long minutes before setting them down. "Mr. Callaway," she said, "this raises a significant concern beyond the scope of today's hearing. If your investor disclosures misrepresented the true source of your firm's funding, that is a matter your investors, and quite possibly federal regulators, will want to examine independently of this divorce." Preston felt the room tilt. Diane was already gathering her files, her earlier confidence completely gone. She leaned toward him one final time and said quietly that she could not continue representing him if the disclosure issue became a securities matter, that her license didn't allow her to knowingly proceed once fraud was on the table. She stood, addressed the court briefly, and requested to withdraw as counsel. The judge granted it without hesitation. Preston Callaway, the man who had walked into that courtroom certain of victory, was now alone at the table, watching his entire narrative unravel in real time. The judge called a recess so Preston could secure new counsel, but before he could even stand, his phone buzzed with an alert from a financial news outlet. Callaway Meridian shares halted amid funding disclosure inquiry. He stared at the screen, then at Vivian, who was quietly gathering her things beside her father's old friend and trusted attorney. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply stood, smoothed her jacket, and looked at him one last time before the recess. "I didn't do this to destroy you, Preston," she said softly. "I did it because you were about to walk out of my life the same way you walked into every room, assuming you'd already won before anyone else had a chance to speak." She turned and walked out, her father's old friend beside her, leaving Preston alone with a phone full of falling numbers and a courtroom that suddenly felt much larger and colder than it had an hour before. 1 year later, Preston Callaway's office was a rented desk in a shared workspace 3 subway stops from the Meridian building that still bore his name on the lease, though not on the door. He spent his mornings responding to regulatory inquiries and his afternoons meeting with a legal team he now paid out of pocket, defending himself against allegations of misrepresenting his firm's funding sources to investors. He hadn't been convicted of anything, not yet, but the firm he built had been placed under new leadership while the inquiry continued, and most of his old contacts had stopped returning his calls the week the story broke. He kept a single financial news alert active on his phone, the only one he hadn't deleted. It was for Ashford Lake Holdings, the quiet family investment firm Vivian now ran full-time from the same lake house he'd once called worthless. The alert lit up on a Tuesday afternoon while Preston sat in a coffee shop reviewing his legal bills. Ashford Lake Holdings closes acquisition of Regional Manufacturing Group, expanding sustainable operations portfolio. Beneath the headline was a photograph of Vivian at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, standing beside Walter Ashford, both of them smiling in a way Preston hadn't seen from her in years. A reporter had asked her how a former philanthropist with no formal business background had built a fund that outperformed established firms twice its size. Vivian's answer was simple. "I spent years watching how not to run a company," she said. "I just decided to do the opposite." Preston read the quote twice, then closed the app, set his phone face down on the table, and sat there for a long time in the quiet, finally understanding that the house he'd once dismissed as worthless had been the foundation of everything he thought belonged to him alone.